With all the controversy surrounding the 2.2 patch banners, it's easy to get lost or confused on what's worth spending your primo gems on. And while I'm currently working on a video on how to help you choose between Childe and Hu Tao, I wanted to make a video regarding Childe's new bow, Polar Star. Many of my friends are pulling for its aesthetics, while I have other friends who are pulling for it because they believe it'll be a solid weapon for most characters. So today, we're going to be debunking some of the misconceptions going around involving Childe's best in slot weapons, as well as Polar Star's overall utility. As always, I wanted to let you guys know that I go live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Praxophone, where we both test characters and generally have a pretty good time. Oh, and if you're pulling for the weapon because it looks cool, then your Giga Chat is fucked. So first, I want to talk about Childe's best in slot weapons and why they're best in slot. Not counting Polar Star, we have a couple options for 5 stars. The best weapon for him is Thundering Pulse, which is good if you play with the perfect rotation. And it actually has a different rotation from other weapons in terms of optimization. The preferred rotation for Thundering Pulse is N5C, meaning using 5 normal attacks followed by a charged attack and repeating until you're ready to switch to the next character, which will vary in timing depending on the team. For example, for a team using Xiangling, Bennett, and Sucrose, Childe would only want to use his elemental skill for about 9 seconds. So in that time, you would do as many N5Cs as you can, and then as that time's about to end, you just end with a charged attack before switching off. One of the reasons Thundering Pulse is so good is because it has a crit main stat and it offers normal attack bonus. So it's like Rust if Rust gave you crit. And unlike Rust, it doesn't hurt your charged attack damage. Next up in the list is the Skyward Harp, which is a good overall weapon. It's really comfy and it has a pretty low crit rate main stat, but it's still crit rate, so we take those. The preferred melee combo for this is different from Thundering Pulse because, as I said before, Thundering Pulse stands out from the other weapons. Harp's preferred melee combo is N2C, or 2 normal attacks followed by a charged attack. Harp has been a staple for Childe and for most other bow characters in the game so far, so it's no surprise that Childe takes full advantage of it. Another option is Amos Bow, and the passive of Amos doesn't work with Childe, so it's basically just a stat stick. Unfortunately, as much as I would love the charged attack bonus, it's not there. It also shares the best melee combo with Harp, which is N2C. And then Elegy for the end just gets no value really. He doesn't really need the energy recharge. As far as 4-star options, these are basically all worse than the 5 stars with the exception of Viridescent Hunt, which we'll talk about in just a second. So something I want to mention before we talk about the Viridescent Hunt a little bit is that Childe actually has quadratic scaling on his Riptide. And for those of you who don't know, Riptide is a damage marking that Childe can apply to an enemy that makes it so whenever they take damage from Childe, it deals extra damage to them. What I mean by quadratic scaling is that enemies that are grouped together will have the damage multiplied by a lot. To be precise, the amount of Riptide slashes that go off is equal to the amount of enemies hit squared. For example, one enemy takes 1 Riptide hit, 2 enemies will take 4 Riptide hits, 3 enemies will take total 9 Riptide hits, and 4 enemies will take 16. The more enemies that are in a group, the better, and in content where there's a lot of enemies, Childe's damage can get significantly better. Now going back into Viridescent Hunt, the reason Viridescent Hunt is so good is because it has a grouping utility. It has the ability to bring a bunch of enemies together at once, and when you have enough enemies together, it can actually outperform Amos Bow, so using it in high-end Spiral Abyss when there's not bosses in rotation is going to be super solid. It also has a crit rate main stat, and it has bonus damage from its passive. It's not great, but it's a little bit of extra damage, and the optimal combo is N2C, which is normal attack twice and then charged attack. Next up for 4 stars, you have Blackcliff as a pretty solid option. It has a super valuable crit damage main stat, and it's accessible on the shop even for free-to-play players if you've saved up enough star glitter in the shop. It's in there on a monthly rotation, so some months it'll be royal weapons, sometimes it'll be Blackcliff weapons. Definitely recommend saving up for Blackcliff on your favorite characters. If you're choosing between Rust R1 and Blackcliff R1, Blackcliff is better, but as you get more refinements on Rust, Blackcliff will kind of fall off, and we'll talk about Rust in just a second. Blackcliff's passive is actually pretty strong on Childe because once you kill an enemy, it activates and will improve your damage, and since you get that quadratic scaling, of course, the more enemies you kill with Blackcliff, the better, and it's easy to kill lots of enemies with Childe. Optimal combo for this is N2C. Rust is a solid free-to-play accessible option since it gives normal attack damage bonus, which ends up being huge and ultimately would put the bow ahead of Viridescent Hunt in my opinion if Riptide damage was also multiplied by normal attack damage in his melee stance. It also loses damage on charged attacks, but because you can get it from the gacha off a weapon or character banner, it's still pretty accessible if you're lucky as a free-to-play and will be the best option for them without any of the previously listed weapons. Rust actually uses the Thundering Pulse rotation for melee, which is N5C. It's 5 normals followed by a charged attack. Prototype Crescent is the best craftable weapon for him. Just open up your rotation with a charge shot on a weak point before you enter melee stance, and you'll be able to get back the attack buff from its passive for long enough. It's worth noting that at similar refinements, it gets beaten out by all of the previously mentioned weapons though. And one last thing, I wanted to mention Hamayumi for Childe because there's some incorrect information going around about it being better than Prototype Crescent. The main reason it's not is because Childe's burst does a ridiculous amount of damage. He has insane scaling on his elemental burst, and in order to get Hamayumi's passive to be usable, you need to not use his burst and sit at 100% energy, which loses you a lot of damage in a proper rotation. As far as melee combos, all craftable weapons will use N2C. The specific melee combos I mentioned for Rust and Thundering Pulse aren't technically the highest damage, but they're the comfiest since they're a really tiny DPS drop in comparison to N2C, and they help you conserve a bit of stamina at the same time. If you're interested in the most damage no matter what, N2C with a dash cancel at the end of the charged attack animation will get you the most damage. It can just be kind of difficult to manage stamina that way. And one final note about melee combos is that you can jump cancel as well to conserve a bit of stamina. All of this doesn't matter too much as long as you don't use a 6-hit in this combo. It does look the coolest, but the animation is so long that it loses damage. So you might be wondering, Brax, why did you just talk about weapons for Childe? We've already seen this a million times. The reason I just brought up all of the weapons for Childe is because all of these weapons to some extent are viable on other bow characters in the game. There's not a single bow on that list that is not usable by at least 2 characters. And yes, that includes Thundering Pulse. Thundering Pulse is a solid weapon on multiple different characters. It's best in slot on Childe and Yoimiya depending on who you ask currently, and all the other weapons are just solid options for other characters. So I bring this up because Polar Star does not have that same effect. So let me explain. Polar Star is a bow that's optimized to take advantage of Childe's entire kit. It gives 12% elemental skill and burst damage passively, which helps his burst do more damage and increases his Riptide damage as well. The bow also gives stacks of Ashen Nightstar for performing normal attacks, charged attacks, elemental skill, or elemental burst damage. All of these effects are on hit, which means that it's pretty safe to assume that you won't be able to get stacks against shielded enemies like Abyss Mages. And if you're watching this video after the release of Polar Star, check the pinned comment though, in case the assumption was wrong, and I'll make sure to update it. I really wanted to know and share with you guys what to expect with Polar Star, so with the help of my friend Low Priority, I have this damage chart to share. As always with theory crafting, we have to make assumptions to create a scenario. This scenario takes into account 12-second rotations for Childe, Refinement 1 weapons, Noblesse, 950 attack buff on Bennett, and Pyro Resonance. You can see the full assumptions on screen as well as the results from the simulation. And in this specific scenario, Thundering Pulse and Polar Star are incredibly close for single target, with Heart being right behind them. However, in higher level content with many enemies, you may see Polar Star pull ahead because of its extra Riptide damage. But if you're looking closely, if you divided the bar graph into maybe equal parts, you could see that the difference with Polar Star, even with 4 enemies, isn't that much. It's still an improvement over Thundering Pulse, especially with multiple enemies around, but it's not that big of a difference. So what does this mean? Well, it's Childe's best in slot, assuming you're playing optimally, since it beats out Thundering Pulse and Harp, but the problem that I have with it personally is that it just doesn't beat the alternatives by much. Now, I'm not complaining that it's not good enough. It's his best in slot weapon, and other weapons won't compare unless at higher refinements. I think that's fine. The main issue that I take with it is that its value per dollar is not great when you consider how good Pulse and Harp are on him already, in conjunction with the fact that other bows are also usable on multiple characters. Seeing around a 10% increase in damage in a best case scenario is not too great when you have to risk spending on the weapon banner. Now, if you can afford to spend, or if you main Childe, this isn't as big of a deal since you're more willing and able to spend for your main. However, for free to play and low spenders, it doesn't seem worth the investment in my opinion. Also, if you don't have Pulse or Harp, this weapon seems like a pretty solid option, but when you're a free to play or low spending player, you have to be picky with what weapons to roll for, if you ever even do, because you want to get weapons that work on more than just one character. And unfortunately, due to how the passive of Polar Express works, there's not another character in the cast that can consistently get all 4 stacks and still be used effectively. Fischl's Burst doesn't do elemental skill damage, so by using Polar Star you lose out on Oz uptime. Amber's Baron Bunny elemental skill is delayed until you hit it with a charge shot at a higher constellation, but then that charge shot won't even activate the stack. Diona doesn't deal much damage to begin with, so it's not really a good option for her. Ganyu can take advantage of this weapon somewhat, but Amos is still better, and keeping up stacks with Ganyu takes away your ability to run her with Xiangling Melt because you have to use her burst, and her burst will ruin any chance you have of getting the reverse melt with Ganyu. Sara could use it for the base attack, but that's about it. Venti doesn't want it because he wants Elemental Mastery or Elegy, and Yoimiya's elemental skill doesn't do any damage, meaning at max, Yoimiya could only get 3 stacks. Polar Star doesn't really work well with other characters. The only value you're going to get out of it on characters outside of Childe is that it's a stat stick that's pretty decent, right? In some cases, it may be better than 4-star options, but that's not even all cases. So while Polar Star looks really cool and has 5-star base attack and crit rate main stat, I can't recommend this weapon in good faith if you're not a whale or dedicated Childe main. I have always valued new characters over weapons because having more characters on the roster means you have more potential synergies to optimize your teams, and if you have Skyward Harp or Thundering Pulse, you could definitely save those Polar Star pulls towards the Dainsleif banner in 2038, but yeah, guys, ultimately, Polar Star just is not really that worth it in my opinion. Especially if you have Thundering Pulse or Skyward Harp, you just really don't need the weapon that much. The damage increase won't really be that significant, and Xiangling's doing most of the damage anyways. Plus, with somebody of the 4 stars actually being really solid on him, like Virdess Hunt if you bought the Battle Pass, I just don't really see the reason to go for it unless you're whaling. In my opinion, as a low spender or free-to-play player, definitely just save your pulls for something like Staff of Homa. If you're going to go for the weapon, I wouldn't even recommend going for a weapon if you're on free-to-play, to be honest, but you know, some free-to-play players like to go for it. Since it's almost the time of the year last year when Dragonspine released, I think it's safe to say we'll get another Dragonspine event soon, and that'll probably come with Albedo reruns, so if you're saving for him, that's something to keep in mind. Overall, Polar Star is a solid weapon for Childe, but that's about it. In the comments, let me know if you're Polar Star or Skipper Star, or tell me what banner you're most excited for in 2.2 or 2.3 now that we know what characters are coming then. As always, make sure to subscribe and like the video if you've enjoyed, and I will catch you guys later.